I was a freshman, excited to attend my first college party. I arrived at the party and didn't know anyone there, but I was determined to make friends. As the night went on, I had a few drinks and danced with a few guys. I was having fun until I noticed something was off about the party. The music was too loud, the lights were too dim, and there were too many people crammed into the small apartment. Suddenly the doorbell rang, and a group of guys I didn't recognize walked in. They were older than the other partygoers and looked like they didn't belong there. They brought in a cooler of beer and started handing out cans to everyone in the room. I grabbed a can and took a sip, but immediately felt sick. Something was wrong with the beer. I looked around and saw that other people were also starting to feel sick. As the night went on, the situation grew more and more unsettling. The older guys started making lewd comments to the girls, and some of the guys in the room began to get aggressive. I realized that I needed to leave, but as I tried to make my way to the door, I was cornered by one of the older guys. He whispered something in my ear, and I felt a hand on my thigh. I tried to push him away, but he was too strong. He dragged me into a bedroom, and the door shut behind us. I tried to fight back, but I was too weak from the drink. I blacked out, and when I woke up, I was alone in the room, naked and covered in bruises. I stumbled out of the apartment and made my way back to my dorm room. The next day, I reported what had happened to the police. They investigated, but no one could be identified or charged. The older guys had slipped something into the beer that made everyone sick and disoriented, and no one knew who they were or where they had come from. From that night on, I was haunted by the memory of the college party. I never went out to parties again and had trouble trusting people. The horror of that night stayed with me for the rest of my life. I was walking home from work thinking about what I was going to cook for dinner when a van pulled up beside me. The man driving the van asked me for directions, and as I was answering him, I felt a sharp pain in my neck. The world went black, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in a dark room, my hands and feet tied, and a blindfold covering my eyes. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious, but I knew I had been kidnapped. Days went by, and my kidnapper brought me food and water, but he never spoke or revealed his identity. I was alone, scared, and had no idea what was going to happen to me. As the days turned into weeks, I began to lose hope. I couldn't imagine ever seeing my family or friends again, and I started to accept that I would be trapped in this room forever. But one day, I heard a sound that gave me hope. It was the sound of a door opening and closing, and I heard footsteps approaching my room. The door opened, and a man entered. He removed my blindfold, and I saw the most unexpected sight. It was a police officer. I couldn't believe it. I was being rescued. The officer untied me, and I stumbled out of the room, weak from my captivity. As we walked through the house, I saw that it was filled with torture devices and blood-stained tools. I couldn't imagine what horrors would have been inflicted on me if I had been left there any longer. The kidnapper was arrested and put behind bars, and I was reunited with my family. It was a long road to recovery, but with the help of therapy and the support of my loved ones, I slowly began to heal. Now, years later, I look back on my kidnapping as a reminder of my own strength and resilience. It's a reminder to never take my freedom for granted, and to cherish every moment with the people I love. While the memory of my kidnapping will always be a part of me, I'm grateful that I was able to survive and overcome the horrible experience. It's changed my whole outlook on life. It was about 9 years ago when I made the mistake of joining an adult dating site. I was looking for some fun, and I didn't think there was any harm in it. But looking back, I realized how naive I was. I ended up chatting with a guy who seemed nice enough at first, but then he started asking me personal questions. I stupidly gave him more information than I should have, including the name of the McDonald's where I worked. He kept talking about how he wanted to meet me on my break and have some fun. I told him no, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. I started to get scared when he showed up at my job one day and ordered the Big Mac meal, just like he had said in his message. I told him I wasn't interested, but he wouldn't leave me alone. I was worried he might try to follow me home or something, so I decided to wait in the back room for a while until I knew he was gone. I eventually left work, and I was scared the entire walk home. I kept looking over my shoulder, worried that he might be following me. Luckily, he didn't show up again, and I made it home safely. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. I should have been more careful about what personal information I shared online, and I shouldn't have given him my phone number. It's scary to think about what might have happened if I hadn't been as cautious as I was. I don't think he ever messaged me, or I ended up blocking him or something. I don't know if this really is all that creepy, but it creeps me out that some random person just decided that he would show up to my job and expect me to want to meet up with him. So, yeah, now, I just give a vague response as to where I work now. I don't work in the same town I live in, so it would be hard to pinpoint my exact location. This opened my eyes and made me more aware of the information I give out to strangers. For years, I didn't even remember this happened. I just blocked it from my memory. I'm not exactly sure of my age when this happened, but I believe I was around 4 to 5 years old. It was morning. My mom and I went to a pharmacy a couple blocks away from our home. As soon as she was getting back in the car, a man approached her from behind and told her to act as if she knew him and to sit in the passenger seat. She noticed he had a gun, so she complied. He sat in the driver's seat and drove. During the whole way, my mom tried to calm me down, telling me he was a friend and needed a ride, while I sat in silence. He drove us to a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. Then he got out of the car, stole the money my mom had with her, and told her not to call the police. After that, she just drove us back home. Almost a year ago, I was an opener at a resort, clocking in before 5 a.m. each day. The resort is located inside of an affluent neighborhood in a very wealthy suburb. Employees had to park in one of 2 parking lots at either ends of the property, and the lot I chose was adjacent to a long and windy road outside the resort, which lead to the rest of the neighborhood. The road and resort were separated by a short range of brush and trees that no one ever walked through. I'd arrived one morning per usual and put the car into park with my headlights still on. The lights in the lot weren't ever on in the morning since no one else really showed up before 6 a.m. when the sun was out, so it was usually always dark at the start of my walk. Save for security, I was one of the first employees to arrive on the property each morning and was usually completely alone in this particular parking lot at this time. This morning didn't seem any different. I had my hand literally at my keys, my brain in the process to turn off my car, when I noticed a young girl, maybe like 14 or 15 years old, come scampering. Her body language was the exact definition. Run with quick, light steps, especially through fear or excitement, through the span of trees that separates the resort from the outside road. She was directly in front of my car, and my headlights illuminated a clear view of her in the pitch black. She looked like she was in high school, had long blonde hair, and was wearing a jacket with pajamas maybe, like she'd just walked out of a house. One thing about her that bothered me was that she wouldn't stop laughing and smiling. I couldn't hear her laughing from outside the car, but she was visually giggling at something I wasn't aware of or could see, and it was so unnatural. She occasionally glanced behind her as if someone else were there waiting away from the headlights. She then waved at me like it were a normal gesture at this time, and then immediately ran to my passenger side door. This all happened in a matter of seconds, and I wasn't really sure what was even happening besides my anxiety spiking. I know I simultaneously yanked the aux from my phone to shut whatever song had been playing off while grabbing for the lock button. I remember feeling panic for never remembering if it's up or down to lock when the girl began pulling violently and incessantly on the door handle on the passenger's side. I realized because I didn't turn my car off, it had stayed locked. She began pounding on the window, and I was screaming at the top of my lungs for her to leave before pressing on my horn. I could see her laughing outside like this were some type of game, as if I were a silly friend not letting her in as a joke. After a few seconds, she stopped the pounding and trying to open my car door. Her face fell flat like I disappointed her, and she started to walk away from my car back the way she came. She waved at me again before squeezing through the trees, out of the view of my headlights. This whole encounter confused me almost as much as it scared me. Most people I told the story to just chalked it up to her being on drugs, but that narrative hasn't felt right to me despite her behavior. Maybe she was just being an extremely out-of-touch teenager whose parents need a firmer grip on her. My first thought was possibly human trafficking, but I'm not sure if that would fit this scenario as I'm not the most well-versed with the subject. I told someone when I made it back home, but they didn't seem to care much. I didn't call the police, and I regret that. I'll never get out of my brain, though, how off the feeling was watching a stranger, seemingly alone, pop out from the trees in the darkness laughing, and then try to violently enter your car in an empty parking lot. I do think the possibility of someone else being present the whole time is a lot more scary, and I wonder who else was there and where exactly. My mother was stationed at Kadena Air Force Base around the late 2010s, and being a military child at the age of 12, my life had reset once again. I didn't have friends again, and I had to learn an entire new neighborhood. I didn't really have anything that made me ecstatic. That is, except the Pokemon League held on base. It was ran by a few people who earned their judge cards from Nintendo and held tournaments and just open game nights. It was really fun picking up the card game, playing in the video game. They even had a small gym and Elite Four system. I made a lot of friends, and one of them was one of the judges, who I am thankful still to this day, because if it wasn't for him, I may not be here right now. The judge in question, who we will call Professor Getsu for the sake of anonymity, was a nice dude. He was the youngest of the three and wore a white professor getup. He looked maybe on the edge of his teens, early 20s with dark hair and glasses and a skinny frame. He was extremely helpful to newcomers, sort of like the big brother we could all look up to and strive to beat in our children's cars and video games, even if his game name of Getsu was a bit nerdy, even for me. He was always one of the last people to leave, helping to clean up, and he supposedly lived nearby. This last thing is important for what's about to happen. It was a bit of a colder night when the event ended. I was sitting outside in the parking lot, scrolling through memes my friends texted me as I waited for my parents to arrive to pick me up. I was just kind of zoning out as the time clicked by when I heard someone nearby. Hey girly, you play Pokemon? I would look up at some really big dude, kind of chubby looking. I saw him every now and then in the events, and he didn't really stand out to much. I give a small nod, said, "Yeah, I do," as he gives this wide smile, like creepy wide. He starts walking forward and I am hit with this nasty stench, like bad body odor. I blink a bit as I see he's walking from a black sedan with its back door open. "I got this cool card collection. Come here, let me show you." Now, my parents have always taught me stranger danger, but my kid brain thought, hey, he went to events and I saw him, so B should be fine. At least, so I thought. Until he grabbed my wrist and started to drag me to the sedan. To say I immediately started screaming is an understatement. Stinky didn't care, though. He was still dragging me, saying how I will have fun and throwing out things about trading cards. Like someone listening would think that he was dealing with a whiny kid. I honestly thought that I was going to be taken, and I would never see my mom and dad again. That I would be on the back of a milk carton and never seen again. Silly, I know, but I was rather sheltered about dying and death at that time. Thankfully, Professor Getsu had walked out at that very moment, presumably on his way to walk home. All I know is I hear the sound of fabric hitting this dude's face as Professor had swung his professor coat right into the dude's face. I feel his hand go to where the dude's grabbing my arm, and I see his hand grab Stinky's pinky finger and yank back, hard. Stinky let go and yowled like an animal as Professor pushed me back behind him as he yanked his coat off of the dude. He then kicked at the back of the dude's knees as he caused him to buckle as Professor grabbed his wrists and pulled back on them. Stinky groaned in even more pain as Professor looked at him with just a cold look in his eyes. The big brother figure was gone, and something else in its place. And I think I was a bit scared of it. Professor's tone of voice when he spoke didn't help either. Like icy daggers lingered with his words against Stinky. "If I see you back here, or doing this shit to my charges, this will pale in comparison to what Japanese prisons will do to you." Stinky would scramble away and get into his car and peel out of the parking lot, Professor glaring at him till he was out of sight. He would then guide me inside of the venue, buy me some fish and chips, and sit down with me until my parents arrived. That cold persona he had when he kicked that dude was gone, back to being the big brother I knew. To be frank, that frightened me. I didn't quite understand why the teenager was so aggressive. I only later learned that Professor Getsu was a black belt who taught kids how to defend themselves with his mother at the local activity center. I suspect he had something of a protective persona or something in his own life led him to act in as much a way. He explained the situation to my folks when they arrived. I wasn't allowed to go to the events and league as much as I used to, but did from time to time. Professor Getsu was still his normal self at the events and helping people, but he would stop coming to the events a year afterwards, his license having expired and his father moving out of the country soon. This is around 2017 in spring or fall. I was 19 at the time, and I live in Germany. Me and my friends used to hang out at a friend's basement, smoke the good stuff, and play video games or watch movies until late at night. My best friend at the time lived just a couple houses down the street from where I lived, and usually it was the two of us riding our bikes back home. There was two routes we used to get home, one through the city or the other, significantly shorter one through a small forest, maybe 1 kilometer, completely dark but proper forest road. That route made a 90-degree turn to cross some rails and a major unlit highway via a bridge. We only took that route when we were equipped with lights and in a group of at least 2 people, because there were a lot of boars and you don't want to be on your own in case something happens. So one night we set out to ride home both quite stoned and maybe a couple beers in, but not off the deep end. As we got close to that 90-degree turn where the road heads up the bridge, my friend who was riding in front suddenly brakes because there was a relatively large tree laying across the road. We both took our bikes and lifted them over the tree and continued. Maybe 10 to 20 meters later, we suddenly spot a fire on the side right at the junction where we had to make our turn, just the size of a small campfire. We both got a little slower as we saw the fire, and then when getting closer, we spotted 6 or 7 people around the fire, forming a semicircle all facing us. All of them were wearing long white dresses or gowns with masks. Not Ku Klux-like masks, but rather like a sailor's hat with veils. A couple of seconds went by. We were just staring at them, and I guess they were staring at us. Then one of them moved towards us, and we started to sprint away towards the bridge on our bikes, and didn't stop until we were on a well-lit road again. That's been the craziest stories among me or my friends ever since. But please, people, let's not meet again. This happened a few years ago, right before the pandemic hit. In fact, I know the exact date because it spooked me to my core. It was February 18th, 2020. I was 14 years old, so you can imagine this was a pretty frightening moment for a young girl. My mother, younger brother, and I went to go see a movie. He wanted to see the new Sonic film, and I didn't really want to, so I went to see the Birds of Prey movie with Harley Quinn. I had already seen the move, but I wanted to enjoy the cinema popcorn and hot dog, and quite frankly wanted to watch it again. I'd gone off by myself to the viewing room and it was completely empty. Just me in there, so I felt relatively safe being able to see the whole room given I was at the very top. It was pretty amazing to have an entire room to yourself, until it's not. About halfway through the film I went to the restroom. The soda didn't last long, so I went to the restroom, and once again it was just me in there. Every room was in current running progress, so nobody wanted to miss the films. As I was finishing up, there was an elderly woman was at the sink, about 70. I thought I was alone, but I suppose not. She was washing hands right next to me. She had moved from her original spot. Now, for context before I say what she said to me, I'll give you a brief description of myself. I have black hair, green eyes, relatively sharp features, high cheekbones and arched brows. Yeah, a typical Disney villain, which I somewhat blame for her response. I think I'm somewhat attractive, but nothing to lose your marbles over. She had looked at me with the most subtle but unnerving grin, still with her hands under the water but not doing anything, and said, "Young lady, you are quite a gorgeous girl." I said thank you, and she went on to say, "A beauty like that is only something an evil thing can have. Your eyes are just so hollow and soulless," she continued with that same damn smile. I was seriously starting to get creeped out, but I do live in the Bible Belt of Texas, so I chalked it up to her being a nut job. But then she got closer and said without the smile, "You shouldn't have that beauty." I hurried and left as soon as I possibly could. I didn't not like being alone with that woman anymore, and I waited outside the restroom where it was populated, but she never came out. After 5 minutes, I went back to the viewing room and was paranoid the entire rest of the film. I could not get that crazy lady out of my head. Like, who says that to a kid? I seriously considered getting exorcised by a priest after that encounter. After that, I told my mother, and she didn't let me go alone until I was at least 16. Never do I want to see that woman again. I still get paranoid after that anytime I'm alone in a public restroom. In fact, I avoid them altogether. Still don't know what to make of it.